So last night I watched a documentary on YouTube about being gay in the 1930s. I'm always curious what it was like to be gay during a decade or an era that I was not alive, right? Because you just wonder, like, how did they meet other guys? Were they walking on eggshells? Like, how did this work? So I'm gonna put the link in the description box of this video as well as in the comment section if you are curious to watch it. I highly recommend it, even if you're slightly curious, because it's not that long, it's only half an hour, and it was so interesting. If you end up watching it, please come back to this video to comment what your thoughts were, what you thought was interesting. But basically, I want to spend this video sharing what I thought was compelling about this documentary. By the way, it's a British documentary from the 80s. So basically, the guys talking in the documentary about their experiences, they were young men in the 30s. So the documentary is pretty old, but it's pretty cool that they got guys who lived through it, right? They're not just telling secondhand stories. This is their stories of being in London as gay men in the 1930s. Because it's a British documentary, I tried to channel my most British haircut yet. I'm gonna call this Britannia cool, posh British, Yorkshire, Manchester. Okay, that's enough of that. So the first thing I thought was really interesting was this idea that the general public didn't even know what homosexuality meant at the time, meaning these young gay adults in the 30s were having the time of their life because they knew where to go to find guys to have fun with, and the general public was kind of naive about all of this stuff. So it allowed these young men to kind of get away with what they wanted, like prostitution, which I'll get back to in a second. But I thought this was so interesting to think that there was a time about 100 years ago where the general public just like didn't fathom the idea of what it meant to be gay. Like, of course, people must have known that like there are guys who have sex with other guys, but the concept of the identity of a gay man, like somebody who's only interested in other men, was foreign to anybody, I guess to the general public, other than obviously gay men themselves. We can't even compare our time today to any time before modern media, because if you think about that era, right, the 30s, it's radio era and newspaper era. Was TV even, I guess TV was probably, like film was probably just starting. I could be wrong, I'm not a cinema history maven, but I feel like 100 years ago, TV and film were obviously not where it is today. Obviously social media did not exist. So I always think about that with like war, right? World War I, World War II, the ignorance of the public when it comes to things like the Holocaust, that people didn't realize it was going on or didn't care enough. But if you think about it, if there's only one main medium being radio, right? And that's controlled by the government or by one huge corporation, like one dominant entity, then all the information that's being disseminated into small towns, into villages, right, into neighborhoods, it's unanimous and singular, and there isn't an ability to sort of digest the nuances of different kinds of content and diverse content and different opinions. So now I'm getting political, but my point is, going back to this gay thing, if you think about it, people's access to information and to knowledge was so much more limited even 50 years ago, forget 100 years ago, but with this documentary that I'm talking about, it's 100 years ago. So it kind of makes sense in a weird way that people who are really, again, naive and like sheltered from anybody who's different from them physically, racially, socioeconomically, culturally, and so on, it makes sense that they like would not even understand the concept of what it means to be gay. So I mentioned prostitution earlier in this video. This was also fascinating to me, that basically this concept of like gay for pay already existed. They just didn't call it gay for pay. So the guys in this documentary talk about how they had like a field day in the 30s as young men because they knew where to go. So they would go to these, I think they said the West End neighborhood of London, And so there would always be guys, oftentimes apparently like military and sailors, so uniform guys, who were basically male prostitutes, who were, because of their roles, right, in society, were always traveling, what we would now consider like middle class or working class, right? So I guess they needed extra money. They're often visiting other towns, other cities, and there was kind of a dance that would be done, and a sort of ritual that was understood by certain men, that this is where you go, and these guys, they mention in the documentary, for 2 shillings you could have fun with them. So it's implied that these guys aren't necessarily gay, these male prostitutes, but that they're, you know, for the right price or whatever, they're open to it. And I feel like this is what people talk about today with gay for pay, right? And you see it in porn too, in gay porn. It's a concept. Whether it's real or not, who knows? But this idea of guys who are just doing it for the money, or male escorts, right? I mean, even on apps like Grindr and Tinder, even I've seen guys say, we can have fun, but for a cost. Like, I'm not doing this for free. And I also think that there's some like internalized homophobia in that, maybe. Like, I'm not convinced that those guys just need extra cash. I think that those are also guys who are either open sexually or are maybe gay, but it's easier for them to deal with their sexuality, like to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, right? They get to experiment with their sexuality, but if they chalk it up to, oh, well, I need the money, then it doesn't really mean that they're gay, right? Like, it's just, oh, I'm just doing this for the money kind of thing, right? And that brings me to my final point in reacting to this documentary I watched, which is, it made me realize, I had this epiphany that every generation, every decade, every era, it's the same themes recycled, but in a different way. Like, it shows up a little bit different, right? So in this case, what the guys in this documentary are essentially talking about is like cruising in these specific areas to find these male prostitutes. But me realizing like, oh, this exists even on Grindr. Like, you see guys that say, I'm only looking for generous men. It's code for that, right? And then it got me thinking about how the first guy I ever dated when I was 21, he was in his 40s. And he had told me that when he was first experimenting with his sexuality in his early to mid 20s, back in the day, they had these, I guess, magazines, or maybe it was the Yellow Pages, like some sort of like publication that you receive every month, and in the back pages, you could find these like hotlines where you could talk to other guys and potentially meet. And so thinking about that, yes, social media didn't exist 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. The internet didn't exist decades ago. So when or people in general wonder, like, well, how did people meet so easily? You know, how did gay guys meet so easily before these apps and all that? You realize there was always a method, right? Before social media, before these apps, it was, you know, Craigslist, it was AOL instant messaging chat rooms. And before that, it was these magazines or bars. And before that, it made me realize too, in New York City, Times Square, which is now very sort of, very much tourist central, but it's a well-known thing that back in the day, I want to say up until the 80s, Times Square was not this polished, fun, family-friendly tourist destination. It was the place where late at night, it was all prostitutes, it was drugs, it was adult theaters. And so I guess if you go even farther back than that, there were these other neighborhoods, like in London, again, West End, I think is what they called it, where people know where to go and people know how to get what they want when it comes to sex, even outside of gay men, right? Just in general, people who have fetishes, people who have sexual fantasies, if they're not getting it at home, or they're ashamed, or there's fear, or there's a taboo element to what they're seeking, they know where to go. And so it kind of dawned on me, this idea of like, people want what they want and they will find it regardless of what's available in that country, in that time period, in that culture. They will find what they want to find. I have this theory that people nowadays, especially Gen Z, are smarter intellectually than ever before because of just the sheer information that's available to you literally at your fingertips, right, on your phone. Back in the day, decades ago, it was like if you wanted to learn about something or research something, you either had to take a class or you had to go to the library. Like you had to make an effort and go seek knowledge out, and it wasn't guaranteed, right? Kind of like shopping. Like you would go to the store and hope they have that one thing, but what if they don't? What if they're out? Nowadays, you just go on Amazon, boom, you find it. So I feel like we've become more intellectual, more cerebral as a society, but I feel like what we've compromised is this sort of ability to figure things out on your own and to let your intuition guide the process, in particular when it comes to interacting with other human beings. So my theory is that these young men in the 30s, yeah, they had to deal with a lot more like maybe hoops and bullshit and maybe more precarious situations, right? If you're looking for like, if you know that the only guaranteed fun you can have with other gay guys is male prostitutes, like that's a certain risk, right? But I feel like these men must have also been so much more intuitive in understanding the dance that happens in connecting with other guys. And this is something I've complained about before on this channel, that I feel like as a society and as an individual, this is something that is harder now than ever to like, to wonder, like, is this person into me? If you don't meet them in a gay context, right? A gay bar, an app, right? If you're just walking down the street and you make eye contact with someone, you don't really know what that person's thinking. And I feel like at this time, 100 years ago, there must have been a clearer sort of path to connecting with people. And one of the guys in the documentary actually says, typically the way these intros would go with a sailor or a soldier in that one particular area of London was you would ask for a cig. So smoking, much like drinking today, drinking alcohol, right, was this sort of this icebreaker, this way to connect with people, to try to engage beyond just a plain conversation. I found that so interesting. If you end up watching this documentary, let me know in the comments what your thoughts are on all of this.